Behind the gilded gates of Topkapi lay a secret too terrifying for the empire to admit. For 600 years, the Ottoman dynasty censored the darkest truth of its royal daughters. The night they feared more than death itself. A night hidden by the empire, erased by its historians, and passed down only in whispers. This is the story of why Ottoman princesses lived in fear of their first wedding night. Before we reveal the empire's darkest secret, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching this video? And subscribe to History Vault, because history is not just triumph and glory. It is also the fear, silence, and sacrifice that empires tried to erase.
In the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire, the sultans ruled not only with the sword, but with a power that reached into the most intimate chambers of their dynasty. Behind the towering gates of the Topkapi Palace, beneath the glitter of mosaics and gold, there existed a reality that few dared to speak of openly. For the princesses of this empire, daughters of absolute rulers who controlled lands from the Balkans to the Arabian deserts, life was not merely about luxury and influence, it was also about fear. That fear was never greater than on the threshold of marriage. Unlike the romanticized tales of royal weddings, where brides were adorned in jewels and celebrated with music and poetry, the reality for Ottoman princesses carried an unspoken dread. Their marriages were not the blossoming of love, but the execution of strategy. Every union was a chess move in the empire's survival, and the princess herself was the piece to be moved across the board. The first night of marriage was the culmination of this sacrifice. It was the moment when a princess ceased to be the daughter of the sultan and became the possession of another man, often a man she hardly knew, chosen not for his charm, but for his political usefulness. What unfolded behind those closed doors was shrouded in secrecy, whispered about in the harem, yet carefully hidden from official chronicles. For 6 centuries, much of this story remained censored. Chroniclers who recorded the grandeur of battles and the magnificence of palaces avoided describing the private terror of royal brides. The Ottomans themselves, intent on projecting an image of majesty and divine order, had little interest in recording the tears and trembling of young princesses on the night they were sent away. Yet the fragments that survive, in foreign envoys' reports, in the writings of palace insiders, and in folk whispers that refuse to be silenced, reveal a pattern of fear, ritual and coercion that defined these marriages. To understand why the first night of marriage loomed so heavily over these women, one must begin with the harem itself. Contrary to modern misconceptions, the harem was not merely a pleasure house. It was a school, a prison, and a political factory all at once. For a princess raised within it, life was a cycle of lessons, restrictions, and surveillance. She learned how to carry herself, how to speak, and above all, how to obey. But what she was never taught was how to face the reality of a marriage arranged without her consent. Thus, when the time came, the moment was not greeted with joy, but with silence, tension, and often dread. To the outside world, the marriage was a triumph, another bond sealed, another alliance secured. To the princess herself, it was a descent into the unknown, where her body and her future were suddenly no longer her own. This fear was not exaggerated. The Ottoman court had strict, often brutal rules for royal women, especially regarding marriage. Once married, a princess would rarely return to the palace of her birth. She was effectively exiled, sent into the household of a powerful governor or military commander. The first night was the beginning of this exile, and every whisper in the harem reminded her of the harsh fate that awaited those who resisted. The story of Ottoman princesses' first nights is therefore not one of gilded luxury, but of political duty enforced at the most personal level. It is a story censored for centuries because it revealed the vulnerability of women who outwardly seemed untouchable. And it is within this contradiction, between the dazzling surface and the shadowy truth, that we begin our journey into the secrets of the Ottoman harem. If the palace walls of Topkapi could speak, they would not only tell stories of power and conquest, but also of whispered preparations that marked the days leading up to a princess's marriage. For the Ottoman court, marriage was never spontaneous. It was a ritual carefully woven into the machinery of empire, where each step, from the selection of the groom to the smallest ceremonial gesture, carried the weight of politics. The choice of husband was rarely about affection. Instead, it was about balance. A princess could be married to a governor of distant provinces, a military commander whose loyalty needed to be secured, or a statesman whose family influence could stabilize the throne. For the Sultan, giving away a daughter was not the act of a father, but of a ruler. She became an instrument of diplomacy, her fate sealed in council chambers long before she ever saw the man to whom she was promised. Yet while the political stage determined the match, the harem managed the preparation. In the weeks before the wedding, the princess would be surrounded by attendants who instructed her on the ceremonial duties expected of her new role. She was bathed in perfumed waters, her hair combed and braided with pearls, her garments stitched with silver thread. Outwardly, it was a display of splendor, but beneath the glittering surface, a quiet tension lingered. Older women of the harem, themselves bound by memories of similar nights, often whispered warnings. Do not resist. Do not speak unless spoken to. Remember who you are representing. These words were less advice than survival instructions. For the princess, they served as a reminder that her first night was not her own. It was an extension of the empire's authority. On the day of departure, the spectacle unfolded with calculated grandeur. Musicians played, carpets were unrolled, and gifts were displayed for all to see. Envoys and officials praised the union, and chroniclers recorded the beauty of the princess, the richness of her dowry, and the magnificence of the procession. But none of them described the tremor in her hands or the dread that gripped her heart as the gates of Topkapi closed behind her. For she knew that she was leaving not only the palace, but her freedom. The journey to her husband's household was often long, winding through cities and provinces where the people gazed at her as a symbol of imperial glory. Yet inside the closed carriage or litter, the princess sat in silence, shielded from the world outside, her mind weighed down by what awaited her. Every mile carried her further away from her family and deeper into the unknown. By the time she arrived at her new residence, she was no longer the daughter of the Sultan in the eyes of the court. She was a wife, bound to a man she may have never spoken to before. The palace rituals had stripped her of choice, and now the weight of expectation bore down upon her. The first night of marriage was not a private event, but a confirmation of alliance, and it carried with it all the pressure of dynastic duty. What is most striking about these unions is not simply the lack of consent, but the immense secrecy that surrounded them. Ottoman chroniclers rarely recorded the intimate struggles of princesses, but European envoys, who often sought to peer behind the veil of the harem, left scattered notes about the fear, the tears, and the silent obedience that accompanied these marriages. It is through their fragmented testimonies, paired with the preserved traditions of the palace, that we can reconstruct the atmosphere of dread that lingered over these young women. This veil of silence was no accident. To acknowledge the fear of princesses would be to admit weakness within the most powerful dynasty of the Islamic world. And so, the empire hid the truth for centuries, crafting an image of harmony and grandeur, while behind closed doors, daughters of the dynasty braced themselves for nights that filled them with terror rather than joy. When the celebrations ended and the guests dispersed, the true ordeal for the princess began. What the empire presented as a grand alliance and joyous union quickly transformed into a private trial that every royal bride feared. The first night of marriage was not cloaked in romance or tenderness. It was a ritual of power, heavy with symbolism, and defined by expectations that left little room for compassion. The chamber itself reflected this duality of splendor and control. The bridal room was adorned with silks, carpets, and golden lamps. But its opulence was not meant to comfort the princess. It was meant to impress the husband and to remind her that she carried the weight of the dynasty's prestige. Every cushion, every jewel, was a silent witness to her role as both bride and sacrifice. Before the couple was left alone, palace officials often carried out ceremonial inspections. Some traditions demanded that the presence of witnesses or attendants ensured the legitimacy of the marriage. Though not always explicitly intrusive, the implication was clear. The union had to be consummated to prove its authenticity. The princess was not simply a woman beginning a new life. She was a contract made flesh, and the fulfillment of that contract was watched with the cold detachment of bureaucracy. For the bride, this was the source of deepest fear. She was expected to submit without hesitation, regardless of her feelings toward the man chosen for her. Many of these husbands were much older, seasoned governors or commanders hardened by years of war and politics. Others were strangers with whom she shared no bond but the empire's decree. The princess entered the chamber knowing that refusal was not an option. Her silence and obedience were as crucial to the alliance as any treaty signed by her father. Foreign accounts, though often fragmented, describe the trembling of royal brides, the tears they fought to suppress, and the unease that hovered in the chamber long after the doors were closed. For some, the fear came not only from the act itself, but from the realization that they had stepped into exile. The first night was the crossing of a threshold, from daughter of the House of Osman to wife of a man who now held authority over her fate. The secrecy surrounding these nights was deliberate. Chroniclers rarely mentioned them, and official records glossed over the details with vague words like, "The union was completed." Yet among the harem women, stories circulated in hushed tones. Older attendants warned the younger girls of what awaited them. They spoke of the coldness of husbands who viewed their wives as tokens of power, and of the loneliness that followed the ceremonies once the echoes of music and celebration had faded. The fear was compounded by the knowledge that the first night set the tone for the rest of the marriage. A husband displeased with his bride could make her life unbearable, confining her, neglecting her, or treating her as a pawn with little dignity. Conversely, a union that began in uneasy compliance could still grow into mutual respect over time. But the uncertainty of that first night left most brides with a heart full of dread. For the princesses of the Ottoman dynasty, this night was not simply about personal vulnerability. It was about the crushing weight of expectation. Failure to submit, failure to satisfy, or even the appearance of reluctance could ripple back to the palace, straining alliances and bringing shame upon their family. And in an empire where honor was currency, shame was a burden no princess could afford to bear. It is this intersection of politics, secrecy, and coercion that made the first night of marriage such a haunting memory for Ottoman princesses. Though wrapped in the language of celebration, it was, in reality, the stark unveiling of their lack of choice. It was the night when their private fear met the empire's public image, and in that collision, their silence became as binding as the marriage contract itself. For the princess, the dawn after the first night was not a morning of new beginnings, but the first step into exile. With the consummation of marriage, she ceased to belong to the imperial household of her father and was now absorbed into the household of her husband. That transition, though cloaked in ceremony and grandeur, was a silent rupture, the breaking of one identity and the forced assumption of another. Unlike European queens who often shared in governance with their royal consorts, Ottoman princesses had little say in the politics of their husbands' provinces. Their purpose was to bind alliances, not to exercise authority. Yet paradoxically, their presence was political in itself. Her governor or commander married to a sultan's daughter held an elevated rank, one that shielded him from certain rivals and tightened his loyalty to the dynasty. The princess embodied that alliance, even if her voice was absent in its execution. Life after marriage was often lonely. Removed from the familiar routines of the harem, she now lived in a residence where every servant, guard, and attendant answered not to her, but to her husband. She was expected to adapt quickly, to manage the domestic sphere, and to produce heirs who would strengthen her husband's lineage. And though she was of royal blood, she was not immune to the anxieties of her position. The fear of childlessness, the pressure to conform, and the looming shadow of political intrigue followed her wherever she went. For many princesses, the greatest wound was separation from their natal family. Once married, they rarely saw their fathers or brothers again, Letters were exchanged, sometimes laden with formality, but physical visits were infrequent. A daughter who once walked the halls of Topkapi Palace, surrounded by the echoes of empire, now found herself in distant cities like Aleppo, Damascus, or Baghdad, far removed from the center of power. This was intentional. Her very distance ensured that her husband's loyalty remained tied to the throne, for his connection to the dynasty was embodied by the woman he now lived with. Yet this arrangement carried an irony that the empire itself never acknowledged. Princesses who appeared untouchable, adorned in jewels and silks, were in reality among the most powerless of all Ottoman women. Their wealth and prestige concealed a lack of autonomy. Their marriages, unlike those of concubines who might wield influence as mothers of sultans, often ended in quiet isolation. Whispers from within the harem suggest that princesses sometimes resisted, pleading with their mothers or stepmothers to intervene. But even the Valide Sultan, the queen mother, had little sway once a match was decreed by the sultan himself. Refusal was not an option, compliance was survival. And so, the cycle repeated. Another daughter sent away, another alliance secured, another woman silenced beneath the weight of empire. The days that followed the first night were a mirror of what lay ahead. Duty without choice, silence without relief. The princess's fear did not dissipate with marriage. It settled into a quiet endurance that defined the rest of her life. In this way, the empire achieved what it desired: stability through sacrifice, power through silence. It is here that the contradiction of the Ottoman dynasty is most visible. An empire that could command armies, build mosques of breathtaking beauty, and govern vast territories could not afford to allow its daughters freedom in the most personal of matters. Their lives were written into the empire's script, their roles predetermined, their voices carefully erased from official memory. And so, while chronicles boasted of the empire's glory, the truth remained hidden in the quiet despair of its princesses, women who carried both the pride of their dynasty and the scars of their submission. To truly understand why Ottoman princesses feared their marriages, one must look beyond the ceremonial night and into the rules that bound their lives afterward. Marriage did not free them, it shackled them further, trapping them in a labyrinth of restrictions that defined every aspect of their existence. The Ottoman dynasty operated under strict codes of conduct for its women, and princesses, despite their bloodline, were not spared. Once married, they lived under a double burden: obedience to their husbands and continued loyalty to the dynasty. Their every move was scrutinized, for they represented both households. A misstep was not seen as a personal failing, but as a stain upon the reputation of the Sultan himself. The unspoken rules of their new lives were harsh. A princess was expected to bear children quickly, for her value in her husband's household rested heavily on her fertility. Failure to do so could result in humiliation, neglect, or in extreme cases, quiet repudiation. Some accounts whisper of princesses who were cast aside, left in isolation within the walls of provincial palaces, their titles intact, but their influence hollow. Even the most personal aspects of their marriages were subject to regulation. Princesses could not remarry freely if widowed. In many cases, they were forbidden from remarrying at all, a restriction intended to prevent their alliances from shifting into the hands of rival families. Such a rule meant that a young widow, perhaps in her 20s, could be condemned to spend the rest of her life in seclusion, stripped of companionship and condemned to silence. Punishments for disobedience were rarely written in official records, but hints appear in the reports of foreign envoys and palace insiders. Her princess who resisted her husband or embarrassed her family could face confinement, her movements restricted to a few rooms, her servants replaced with guards. In some cases, her dowry and wealth could be withheld, leaving her dependent and powerless. These measures were not just discipline, they were reminders that no matter her lineage, she was never beyond control. The contrast was striking. To the outside world, these women lived in luxury, wrapped in velvet, adorned with gold, and surrounded by attendants. Yet the trappings of wealth were little more than gilded chains. Their lives were circumscribed by duty, their pleasures dictated by custom, their silence enforced by fear of reprisal. What made these rules even more suffocating was their invisibility. Chroniclers of the empire celebrated the victories of sultans, the expansions of mosques, and the grandeur of court festivals, but they left the struggles of princesses unrecorded. The suffering of these women was deliberately erased, replaced by an image of serene compliance. In this way, the empire maintained its illusion of perfect order, while its daughters endured the private weight of their captivity. For 6 centuries, these rules remained hidden, passed down quietly through the harem, spoken of only in whispers. To admit their existence openly would have been to tarnish the image of the dynasty, which relied on its aura of divine order and majesty. And so the truth remained censored, leaving behind only fragments for later generations to uncover. It is within these fragments that we find the true cost of empire. Daughters who appeared regal and untouchable, yet lived lives defined by fear, restraint, and punishment. Their marriages were not journeys of love, but contracts of power, their lives bound to rules that silenced their voices and erased their individuality. If politics and ceremony dictated the outer life of an Ottoman princess, it was fear and loneliness that defined her inner world. Beneath the jeweled robes and the gold-embroidered veils, there was a human heart struggling against an existence she could not control. The most haunting legacy of these marriages was not only the loss of freedom, but the slow erosion of identity, a psychological toll that shaped every breath of their lives. The first nights left scars, but it was the endless years afterward that hollowed them out. A princess, removed from her family and immersed in a household that did not truly belong to her, often felt like an exile in a gilded cage. She was surrounded by attendants and treasures, but these could not erase the silence that haunted her chambers. Conversations were monitored, friendships were shallow, and trust was a rare luxury. In this atmosphere, fear became a constant companion. The isolation was especially profound for those married off to distant provinces. In Aleppo, Baghdad, or Damascus, a princess might live thousands of miles from the heart of the empire, cut off from her sisters and the rhythms of Topkapi Palace. Letters traveled slowly, visits were rare, and news of her family often arrived only when tied to imperial decrees. In such solitude, the weight of her marriage pressed down relentlessly. Even within her own household, she lived under constant scrutiny. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, reflected not only on herself but on the dynasty. A careless remark could be twisted into disloyalty. A refusal could be branded rebellion. And so, the princess learned the art of silence, of suppressing her feelings, of wearing a mask that concealed the storms within. The psychological consequences of this silence were profound. Some accounts suggest that royal women turned inward, finding solace in poetry, prayer, or the secret companionship of loyal servants. A few princesses became patrons of the arts, pouring their unspoken grief into architecture, literature, or charitable works that outlived them. Yet even these acts were shaped by restraint, expressions of self in a world that allowed them so little freedom. But others were not so fortunate. Foreign envoys whispered of women who became shadows of themselves, withdrawn and joyless, their beauty dimmed by melancholy. Without power, without choice, they endured their lives with quiet resignation, their fear never entirely dissipating. The knowledge that their fate had been sealed without their voice haunted them like a specter. This psychological burden explains why whispers of fear echoed through generations of Ottoman princesses. Daughters watched their mothers, sisters, and aunts suffer the same fate. And in those hushed conversations within the harem, the terror of the first night was passed down as a warning. The dread was not simply of one evening's ordeal, but of the lifelong submission it represented. It is here that the true tragedy of their lives emerges. For while the empire celebrated the grandeur of its dynasties, the women who carried its blood were often broken by the very structures that claimed to honor them. Their fear was not irrational, it was inherited, lived, and relived across centuries, a legacy of silence that no chronicler dared to fully record. And so in the hidden chambers of the Ottoman world, the princesses endured. Their fear was never a passing shadow. It was the quiet rhythm of their existence, the price they paid for being born into an empire that demanded their obedience at the cost of their humanity. History is not only what happened, it is also what was allowed to be remembered. And in the Ottoman Empire, the lives of its princesses were carefully wrapped in layers of silence and censorship. For 600 years, the empire presented itself to the world as strong, orderly, and divinely guided. Any story that threatened that image, especially the vulnerability of its royal daughters, was deliberately buried. The Ottoman chroniclers, known as vakanuvis, worked directly under the Sultan's authority. Their duty was not to record truth as it was, but truth as it was meant to appear. The marriages of princesses were described in glowing terms, alliances sealed with dignity, celebrated with feasts and sanctified by religion. What was never written were the whispered sobs behind the lattice screens, the trembling on those dreaded first nights, or the loneliness that followed. These were not stories fit for the pages of empire. To admit that the daughters of the dynasty lived in fear would have been to admit a crack in the very foundation of Ottoman power. The princesses embodied the dynasty's honor. Their marriages were symbols of control and dominance. Revealing their suffering would undermine that symbolism, turning what was supposed to be a display of strength into a confession of cruelty. Foreign envoys occasionally caught glimpses of this hidden reality. Venetian and French ambassadors hinted in their reports of royal women who lived in quiet despair, their lives consumed by politics beyond their control. Yet even these accounts were carefully worded, for no diplomat wished to anger the sublime Porte. The real stories remained confined within the walls of Topkapi, passed in whispers among servants, and silenced by fear of punishment. The censorship was also cultural. Ottoman society placed enormous emphasis on haya, modesty, restraint, and the guarding of private affairs. To expose the intimate fears of royal women would have violated not only political boundaries, but moral ones as well. And so generation after generation, the truth was hidden behind veils of respectability. But there was also something darker at play. The empire itself thrived on myth-making. Just as the sultans were portrayed as flawless rulers chosen by God, so too were the princesses depicted as dutiful daughters, wives and mothers who embraced their roles without complaint. The reality, that many of them dreaded their fates, was incompatible with the official story. It had to be erased. Even after the empire's fall in the early 20th century, the silence persisted. Nationalist historians, eager to defend the honor of the Ottoman legacy, glossed over these private tragedies. They focused on battles, conquests, reforms, and diplomacy, while the voices of the women remained muted in the background. It was easier to celebrate the grandeur of empire than to confront the suffering it inflicted within its own palaces. Only in recent decades, through careful study of archival fragments, letters, and the rare accounts of servants or foreign observers, have historians begun piecing together the silenced truths. These shards of memory reveal the cost of censorship, the centuries-long erasure of women's voices, women who lived not as the empire's ornaments but as its captives. For 600 years, the fear of Ottoman princesses was treated as a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. The empire had every reason to keep it that way, because once acknowledged, it revealed the uncomfortable truth, that even at the heart of absolute power, the most privileged women were bound by chains invisible to history. 6 centuries of silence, 6 centuries of fear hidden beneath silk veils and marble palaces. The story of the Ottoman princesses is not only about politics, nor simply about marriage rituals. It is about the price of being born into a dynasty that demanded obedience above all else, even at the cost of humanity itself. When we peel back the layers of official chronicles and imperial propaganda, we see not the golden portraits painted by the empire, but the shadows behind them. Young women, trapped between duty and dread, their lives traded like tokens in a game of power, their voices suppressed, their fears erased, their suffering hidden so that the empire's facade of glory would remain untarnished. And yet, history has a way of leaving traces. In forgotten letters, in the quiet notes of diplomats, and in the architecture and poetry that princesses left behind, we find fragments of their truth. A truth that empire after empire tried to bury, that power is never without victims, and that even the most exalted thrones are built upon human cost. As we reflect on their stories, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. History is not just the tale of conquerors and kings, but of those who had no choice. The Ottoman princesses remind us that fear and silence can echo through centuries, shaping not just the lives of the women who endured them, but the memory of an empire itself. So the next time we admire the domes of Topkapi or marvel at the empire's grandeur, we must remember the voices that were silenced within its walls. History is not only triumph and power, it is also pain, secrecy, and sacrifice. And now I ask you, from where in the world are you watching this story? Leave a comment below, because the more we share these hidden truths, the harder they become to erase. Subscribe to History Vault, where we uncover the forgotten, the censored, and the untold. Because only when we confront the shadows of history can we truly understand its light.